Without any further ado, we introduce Megan Dorza from DTAH to introduce the speakers and the event, essentially.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Clubhouse, and thank you for coming. I'm Megan Dorza. I'm an architect and partner at DTAH here in Toronto, just across the Ravine on Park Road. Tonight is the first of two public lectures that are part of an exhibition that we've called RavinePortal. The intent of the exhibition and the intent of these public lectures are to explore issues, contemporary issues that are affecting our ravines, contemplate their past, their present, and their potential future role in our city. How are they doing, where are they going, and how do they get there, and how can we all help that process? Tonight I'm pleased to introduce two speakers. The first is Steve Heuchert from the TRCA, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. The second is Andrew Davies from Number 9 Contemporary Art and the Environment, who will lend us their unique perspectives on the potential of the ravines to exist as an interconnected, public, and accessible open space for all. Steve is Senior Manager of Development Planning for the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and has been working to protect and preserve Toronto's ravines for over 10 years. Trained as an environmental planner and urban geographer, Steve is a professional planner in Ontario as well as the UK and imbues a strong passion for the natural environment and excellence in urban design in all of his work. Andrew Davies is a public art consultant and co-founder of Number 9 Contemporary Art and the Environment, a charitable arts organization committed to using art and design to bring public awareness to environmental concerns. With Number 9, Andrew has overseen the administration and production of over 21 major public art installations, many of them existing in Toronto's ravine system, particularly the Dawn. He's also delivered environmental art and sustainable design educational programs to over 12,000 inner-city youth in Toronto. As an independent art consultant, Andrew has contributed his unique perspective on the power of public art to numerous public planning projects, including the Lower Don Trail Master Plan, and our office was lucky enough to work with Andrew on that initiative. So the format for tonight is that each speaker will speak for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, and after which we're going to open up the floor to a conversation and a discussion, and I'll moderate that. And I would invite you all to also attend the next lecture in this series, which is scheduled for October 30th, again a Thursday evening at the Brickworks, so 550 Bayview Avenue. And the topic that will be discussed on October 30th is pertaining to the precedent of the Lower Don Trail Master Plan as the potential way forward as we address the future of the ravines, and also other kind of brainstorming ideas around what the ravines will look like 30 years from now, given that we are going to accept into our city's boundaries another 2.5 million people in the next 30 years. So tonight's event would not be possible with the generous support of the Trees and Parks Foundation. They've donated their space to us tonight, and so I would encourage you all to look up the amazing work that they do and support them in their efforts. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Steve Heuchert.
Chairs here, if anybody wants to sit there. There's still a couple in the front.
Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have so many people here on this nice Thursday evening. Thank you again. I would like to bring to you today an urban planner's perspective on Toronto's ravines. One does not normally associate urban planning with our natural areas, but indeed the planning profession, in addition to all of the community and a number of activists, has had a profound effect on ensuring so many ravines in Toronto have actually been preserved in perpetuity and put into public ownership. My perspective is one of an environmental planner who's also a bit of a frustrated urban designer, so a bit of a planning geek, shall we call it. I originally studied and wanted to enter the pure urban design field, but there was a day earlier in my career when I was standing in a forest block in suburban New Hampshire, where I was working in one of my first jobs, and it clicked in my head that I had actually worked with the community to compact a development and reorient it in a way that that forest block was completely preserved. And from that point on, I really learned to love the integration of urban design and ecology and never really looked back. So this evening, I'd like to explore the present of our ravines and some ideas on how you, our audience, can enhance them for the benefit of all. And I'm looking forward to our discussion at the end. So we're very tremendously lucky to have the ravines. In the city of Toronto alone, there are over 26,000 acres of them. And this does not include our other more traditional parks like the one we're standing in right now. Now this compares to, say, Manhattan, which has 2,700 acres of parks in total. So if you think about that, and the population, the daytime population of Manhattan and Toronto are pretty similar, around 3 million people. Jobs and people working there, coming in and out of the city. So there's something like 5.6 times the amount of ravines in Toronto per person than there are in Manhattan. So we're really, really lucky. And on the image in front of you, you can see there's a little square yard rectangle. That's Central Park. So if you have a look at the area of ravines versus Central Park, you see we have 30 times the size of ravines in Toronto than we do actually in Manhattan. So we, the collected people of this fair city, have protected for the most part our wonderful ravines. And we have done this to avoid issues caused by erosion and flooding, and to provide a place for infrastructure such as water pipes, and also for our recreation. And more recently, of course, to protect the ecology, which wasn't really as important back in the day. What we haven't been as successful at is fully integrating the ravines and their natural resources into our rapidly growing city. Now, most urban design focuses on built form and the relationship between buildings, the streets, heritage preservation, public spaces, and the like. This is a photograph of the Bridgepoint Health Center, which is right behind us. It's an absolutely wonderful development, and they've done a great job of integrating their development into the ravine. And if you ever get a chance to go in and check out that building, it's absolutely amazing. So I definitely suggest that you do it. It's well worth the time. Now, in some cases, including Bridgepoint, developers working with the city and the TRCA have provided an excellent integration between the built form and the ravine system. This is a photo of the Daniels Kilgory State Residential Development up at Sunnybrook Park. And the designers had effectively replaced a developed area, a previously developed area, with an environmental buffer, a new trail system. They transferred all of that into public ownership and they planted it up with lots of native plants. And they also created this little rotunda, which is a sort of a portal from the street and the residential component of the development into the ravine. So it's very, very well done. Now, unfortunately, this is not how most development happens. This is what you typically see. The ravines rather tend to be sort of the forgotten bits of green and kind of an afterthought. Preserved, of course, for very good reasons, but then the focus goes elsewhere. This building, for example, I won't name any names, turns its back on the valley and the trail. And really, the valley and the trail only lead to storage at the back of the building. There aren't even any windows back there. No thought has been given to how the land use is integrated in with the ravine. Now, this is a huge development, and inside there are lots of restaurants, and they have patios, but they all overlook the parking lot. Why? Now, our obsession has been and continues to be with transportation corridors, parking, strict engineering standards, which is all fine and good. But I do think we can do much better. Here, for example, none of these people in the cars on the right, and this is on Dufferin Street, really know that there's a ravine here and how much beauty actually exists inside this ravine, which is on the left side of the screen. What is also very impressive about Toronto's ravines is the ecology is relatively intact. I have the privilege of traveling to Japan quite a lot to visit my family. My wife is Japanese. And the contrast in the urban areas is quite startling. There are many stunningly preserved parks in Japan, manicured parks, and the Japanese have preserved much of the mountains. Most of the development has taken place in a very compact, transit-friendly form down in the lowlands. But the ecology within the cities have been significantly altered. This is a photograph of a very typical ravine near my family's home in Kobe. And typically the ravines have been generally concreted. And this is a scene from Osaka, where all the infrastructure is kind of laid on top of each other. That's the river at the bottom, and this is a highway bridge next to a bunch of retail developments. So it is very, very urban for sure. Now, what I did is I actually did a Google search for natural ravines in Japan, and I did come up with one, and this is called the Todoraki Ravine. And it's the only natural ravine that remains in Tokyo. It is 1.5 kilometers long. And what I did is I looked up an article in the Japan Times where the old-time residents in this area were talking about this ravine. And they recalled playing when they were little, catching crabs and snakes. But as the article says, this is when the river had a natural bottom and not concrete. This is the actual Todoraki Ravine, a photograph of it. It's very beautiful. I think it's done a lovely job. And people in this very dense part of Tokyo really enjoy it very much. But don't get me wrong, I don't want to criticize Japan. It's a wonderful country, and they do this incredible job with all of the cherry blossoms of the sakura that run along many of these ravines. And you really have to go there to believe it. It's absolutely stunning. Now, Toronto's ravines are also not typical parks in the way we see Boston or New York, with their systems of formal, active green spaces, bounded by straight lines and rows of trees and buildings on the edge. This one, for example, is one of my favorite spots in New York City. This is Bryant Park. It's perfectly rectangular and it's surrounded by 30-story buildings. But if you look at the property boundaries of Toronto's ravines, there isn't a straight line anywhere. When we carve out the ravines, when a development takes place around it, they go like this. They typically follow the contours of the top of the bank of the ravine. So how do we use our ravines in Toronto? The use of the ravines has evolved over time. When they were first developed as active parks with modified floodplains, to infrastructure routes, and more recently for ecological protection and passive trail and nature uses. This is an image from Etobicoke, the Topham Pond, in the flats area of Jane Street in Eglinton. The area was converted to parkland in the 60s, and the wettest area, which had always been too wet to farm, was developed as a small fishing lake. Several small piers were built, a small island was created, and the pond was deepened. In 2013, the local community group, the Mount Dennis Community Association, approached TRCA in the city to hold a family fishing event here. The past July, a second annual event took place, and about 200 people attended, reflecting the vibrant diversity of the Mount Dennis community. Staff were on site to do interpretive studies and also to see which fish species were in the pond, and the Raptor Conservatory actually brought their birds down so the children can see them. The ravines are really a great community building resource. We always have to remember that. But they're also used as natural routes for infrastructure, such as sewer lines, water lines, roads, trails, and stormwater outfalls. This image is of Finch Avenue back in 2005. Many of you know that Finch Avenue actually blew out due to a major storm event. Sometimes nature takes things back and does not take kindly to human intervention within their natural hazards. You can see all the pipes, the road culvert is buried downstream in the river, and the other utilities hanging across where the bridge actually used to be. In new communities, the planning that we do, we don't allow these crossings to run along the ravines anymore for this particular reason. We set where it's absolutely necessary in order to get certain things across. However, there's still significant infrastructure in Toronto that is at risk of flooding. You can't see it very well here, but you can see these little red dots that are spread all over the place. The red dots on the map illustrate the flood vulnerable roads and structures, for example, bridges and pipes. And considerable changes are required to this infrastructure in order to make it more resilient and to deal with the issue of climate change. But this really offers us a great opportunity to replace things in a much better way when the time comes. As we redevelop not only the infrastructure, but our old commercial, industrial, and residential developments, we must treat our stormwater with respect, lest we end up with situations like this on the Don River, where the storm events that have rushed down the creek has basically taken out the trail and much of the infrastructure. It's a really big problem. Now finally, the ravines are used as places of refuge for, as our ecologists like to call it, the bugs and bunnies. Some of the region's largest and most mature trees, including white pines and eastern hemlocks, are actually found in the City of Toronto ravine system. And it's very interesting because you don't see this so much in the 905, because the flatter areas in the 905 were all cleared for agriculture, whereas the deep, deep ravines further south in the City of Toronto, a number of these trees were retained over many, many years. And they actually, our ecologists who do the inspections down here, they actually said they're representative of old growth trees. Now in turn, these same grand old trees are providing prime nesting habitats for these birds, which are called Cooper's hawks. Now Cooper's hawks apparently used to roam in the northern parts of our jurisdiction, but are now making their way south as more and more predators, due to urban development, are finding their way further north. So it's very interesting, and you really just need to ask an ecologist, and they'll tell you these wonderful stories about these birds and the different trees. I didn't know any of this until I was preparing this report. Now this is one of my favorite spots in Toronto, the Humber Marshes. If you canoe south from the Old Mill subway station, and you can actually rent canoes there from a really nice guy named Ted, and take a left near a lovely arts and craft home on the edge of the ravine, you will find this tranquil space where you will see absolutely no buildings. And you're in the heart of the west end of Toronto. And you probably won't see any people either. And it's absolutely magnificent. So a little story about this. I was down here with my friend who has a canoe the other week. And I biked over. It took about 20 minutes. We spent the whole day there. We had a picnic. It was wonderful. And I biked home. And as I was getting into my apartment building, I ran into my neighbor, who looked really, really tired, and she was lugging her luggage into the elevator. And I asked her how her weekend was, and she said to me, well, on Saturday we got in the car and we drove 3 hours up to the cottage, and then we cleaned it, and then we had to fix some things, and then I sort of collapsed in the deck chair, and then we drove home on Sunday, and it was 3 hours, and the traffic was awful. And I was just thinking to myself, no, you should have joined me down the river. Because really, this is Toronto's cottage country. And as more and more people move here, don't have backyards, the real estate's expensive, you need to celebrate places like this, because those people are not going to have cottages to go to. And a lot of us really don't want to drive for 3 hours anyways. And it's quite ironic in that these areas in Etobicoke and North York and in Scarborough, not that long ago, 80 years, were the cottage country of the smaller city of Toronto. So we need to keep celebrating these things. So I didn't want to show you any sort of, charts and maps and that sort of thing, but this one I think is really important. This is a map that is taken from the Conservation Authority's Terrestrial Natural Heritage System Strategy. And what this is a strategy for growing our green spaces. And what we actually did is develop a model of the health of the natural areas in the Toronto area. And this map is a map in the Rouge, in the east end of Toronto. And the dark green color shows very high quality habitat. And you can see that the very high quality habitat is isolated from the urban areas, or the influences of the urban areas, and it is a really big block. And that's when you have really healthy habitat. Most of this stuff is up in the 905. Now you look at further west in Toronto along the Highland Creek, where there's a lot of infrastructure running through here. There's a lot of development, and there's very little stormwater management controls. And you see the orange color shows that the quality of the habitat is very low. And so it's very, very important to recognize that we're going to have to fix these urban edge influences if we're going to actually increase the amount of habitat in our jurisdiction. Because without actually increasing the amount of habitat, if urban development continues the way it has been, we're going to lose about half of the species that we actually still have in our urban areas. This is a plan that Adele Freeman, one of our directors at TRCA, gave me when I was preparing this talk. And she dug it out, and it was all musty and old. It's from the 1960s, and it was the original conservation plan for the TRCA back in the day when we were just building these big reservoirs to control the flooding. And at the time, the people who prepared this plan were extremely visionary in that they understood that a lot of these areas had to go into public ownership. And the reason they wanted to have it into public ownership is to provide recreation uses and reforestation to deal with the massive erosion problems that they had back after the land had all been cleared. So it's very, very interesting how this plan lays out the whole land acquisition process that we've been quite successful in. Now, why do you need to keep these lands in public ownership? Well, one of the problems is that when ravine lands are in private ownership, people tend to love them to death. Or as our lawyer at the OMB says, they like to nibble away at the ravines, with pools and decks and additions to their homes. And so we have these 5 tough-looking guys. They're actually teddy bears, but they patrol our area and they make sure that people aren't building things without permits. And the permitting process is extremely important because of the fact that we need to protect these ravines as a system and not look at them on an individual lot basis. This is an example. The homeowner here decided to obliterate his forested ravine in order to build a very large retaining wall so that they can have more flat land at the back of their house. Now, this may well be a cultural thing. It may just be ignorance of the environment, but this is not the sort of thing that we want to see here in Toronto and in our ravines. Now, the other aspect of the work that we do, and the challenge that we face, is that there is often a perception of not enough land to fully integrate natural areas into urban development. But there are design solutions to this. And now this challenge is really front and center during the development application review process, which often ends up at the Ontario Municipal Board. This, as you can see, is me in the hot seat with all of the lawyers at the board. And it's not an uncommon part of the job. In fact, I quite enjoy it. So we, the public, have acquired thousands of acres of ravines. We've installed our infrastructure. We use them as parks and for their natural ecology. These park infrastructure, human and natural health components are part of a greater ecology that must be preserved and enhanced if the system to accommodate an additional 300,000 people is going to survive. These 300,000 people are estimated to move here sometime before 2031. The area of Ravine is not increasing, and the area of new parkland is only going to increase incrementally in those areas where there is comprehensive redevelopment. So it makes sense then that we must make the ravines more resilient and inviting to those who will demand to use them. I therefore offer some ideas that I hope you will consider as decision makers or community activists and to take away and make happen. Now the first one I like to call public is size, the ravines. Now this photo shows a typical development in the city of Toronto. There's a parking lot, there's this lovely chain link fence, there's garbage loading areas at the back of the ravines. It's very, very typical of what we see. And this is what happens to the ravines when you develop that way. People don't care about them. They throw all the garbage over the chain link fence. Nobody takes care of the natural heritage system at all. Now this is an actual site down at Lakeshore and Parkline in Etobicoke that is being comprehensively redeveloped. I don't know if you've been there recently, but I think there's about 8 40 to 60 story towers that have gone up in the last 3 or 4 years. And this is the Mimico Creek, and this is the actual site, the photos of which I just showed you, undergoing its comprehensive redevelopment. Now, as part of this project, what the developer did, and working with the TRCA, is they actually gave back the ravine. And they restored all of the erosion. They recreated the river channel that used to be concrete. And they are in the process of restoring all of this and connecting up a trail system. Now, it looks pretty horrible, and there was a lot of public backlash when this work started to take place. But this is what it looked like a couple days ago. And this is before the tree planting has taken place and before the trail system has gone in. And you can see how everything is starting to renaturalize. And we really need to do this over successive numbers of sites in order to put back our ravines. In Edmonton, they do a really good job of ravine planning. They don't, my understanding is they don't allow development on the top of the bank of the ravine. Rather, what they do is they put what are called single-loaded roads. And this is the site on the west side of downtown Edmonton. These single-loaded roads act as the public barrier between the ravine and all of the development on the other side. And you can see that both sides of this McKinnon ravine in Edmonton have these single-loaded roads. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's a much more pleasant atmosphere than having all of the private development back onto the ravines. The other idea that I would like to see implemented is to renaturize the ravines. This is just a silly way of saying renaturalize. This is in the Don River. This is a Gadian wall that is blown out due to all of the stormwater management issues. And really the only way to deal with this is to deal with the water and to renaturalize the ravines. The Conservation Authority's Restoration Services staff do some really great work in this. This is the Reeser wetland in the Rouge Park. And on the left side of the screen, you can see what it looked like before. It was an agricultural field that had been tile drained, and the wetland had been drained in order to grow crops. And once the Conservation Authority was able to acquire the land, we went in and redirected all that water back to the wetland and put in a bunch of habitat structures. And now this area has all regenerated and provides a greater water balance for the whole area. This is another project on the Mimico Creek, where the creek had been channelized and the wetland had been drained. And by putting back that water and putting in native plants, we were able to reestablish a lot of the habitat for turtle nesting and all other types of species. My other thought is to design better portals. Now, what is a portal, you say? There's a fellow by the name of Edward White, and he published a short chapter in an academic work entitled Appreciating Public Space in Urban Environments. The chapter is called Path, Portal, and Place, and he speaks to the importance of appreciating the way the 3 primary exterior spaces of an urban area work. The 3 spaces are the path, which is essentially the road that you're taking to get somewhere. The place, which is the destination, like the park or the plaza, the urban plaza, or in this case, the ravine. And then, of course, the portal, which is this small piece of land that joins the 2 together and says to the people traveling along the path, hey, come here, have a look what's beyond, this is exciting and wonderful. This is a picture, again, up on Dufferin Avenue. You can see this is really not a very pleasant portal. And you've got a crash barrier, broken piece of concrete, and right inside there is a bunch of garbage. But if you go beyond this little area, you'll see a tremendous habitat, or a ravine. And there's little stepping stones that you can go down, and you can have a look at the river down below. And yet nobody driving along that road would ever go in there. So Mr. White said, we are changed when we pass through portals. We are altered by virtue of entering public space. becoming urban citizens at a loftier level and feeling the heightened intensity of higher belonging. This alchemical quality of portals endows them with mystery and magic, and I think we need to build some more of them. This is a little better one. This is also in the city on the Don, and you can see, although there's a crash barrier, there's a wide path, there's some nice shrubs, colorful shrubs, a entrance through the trees, and then of course it's all framed by these buildings on the one side, a bit of a Manhattan experience if you want to call it that. And I quite like this spot. It actually draws you into the ravine, makes you want to go there, unlike that other one that I just showed you. Now this is a project on Pottery Road, not far from here, by Plant Architect. The city hired to develop a much better bicycle and pedestrian crossing over a very busy Pottery Road near the Bayview Extension and the Todmorden Mills. And what they did here is they actually took the old riverbed and the banks of the river, and they superimposed it where it used to be onto the asphalt on the crossing using this paving pattern, which is an excellent way of not only celebrating the Don River, but also allowing people to safely cross the road and enticing them to go either into the ravine or to enter the Todmorden Mills. And I really like this project. This is just another shot of it, showing where the portal begins to take you across the road into the ravine. This is another example of a portal. It could be very, very natural, just a clearing in the trees that draw you down into the wetland. This is actually in Nova Scotia. This is in London, England, down in the Docklands. This is the Greenwich wetland and viewing area. You can see the bike path. The portal pulls you into the wetland, which then takes you into boardwalks. And this is right in the heart of London. Right next to this is a very, very high density development. This is also down by the Millennium Dome. This is a green wall that is used to clean the storm water, but it also acts as a portal between the urban area and the park system. Highline in New York, which I'm sure most of you know about. Megan was just there and sent me this picture. This is the wayfinding system. We are actually in the city of Toronto working on a wayfinding project right now, which is quite similar, to try to help stitch the ravines together so that we know where we're going. That's one of the issues, is that we can't always know what's on the other side of that portal. So these signage really help. And then the last idea I'd like to talk to you about is integrating the natural and the urban. This is a shot from Portland, Oregon, showing how they've almost brought a ravine into the city itself. This is a bioswale that provides a water treatment and storage for the paved areas that surround it. We'll treat the water before it goes into the stormwater management system. It's also aesthetically beautiful, and it's a place that you really want to be. This is in Kew Gardens, also in London, and this is a bridge that was built that has a very light touch on the natural environment. Typically when we build our bridges, we dump a whole bunch of fill in there and we put a little culvert and pave it all over. This is a much better way of doing infrastructure. This is a project I worked on with a developer up at 1200 Shepherd Avenue East. And this is just north of the Leslie subway station, and it's an old office complex that's a bit redundant now, and most of the site is paved parking. And we worked with the developer on a process of reintegrating their development into the ravine system while setting it back and providing a much more enhanced ravine. So as part of this, the area I've just illustrated, the developer is going to convey over to the public. They are going to renaturalize the whole western bank of this section of the East Don River. So taking out the invasive species, replacing them with native, cleaning up all the garbage, formalizing the trails. On the left side, you see the red arrow. They're going to build a new trail system down to an existing bridge that crosses the Don River. And that's going to allow people to come from the neighborhood to the north up to the subway station. And then finally, they've integrated a park into the ravine. So they put the park on the edge of the ravine instead of setting it into the middle of the development and putting all the development right on the ravine. So it's a terrific project. It's not built yet. It's still in the planning stage. This is from Copenhagen. This is an example of a development where they actually took an adjoining natural area and they extended the natural habitat right into the courtyard of the development itself. It's an absolutely beautiful space. It allows people to enjoy the natural area without going too much into it and destroying it over time. And it's just tremendous. So you must be getting sick of all my vacation photos. I'd just like to end the presentation with a quote from one of our ecologists at TRCA. I really like this. She says, like loyal pets that greet you at the end of a stressful workday, the ravines are there to tend to sore mental wounds and offer peace and tranquility. Ravines are often the daily stitch that keeps us from emotional unravel, despite our sometimes wanton treatment of them. And I just thought she should really be a poet. And I think this stems a lot from the really hard work that a lot of us do in the planning and ecology fields, try to preserve these really amazing spaces. So that's the end of my presentation. I would encourage you to think about these ideas, think of ways that you can implement them, and keep in touch with us. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we also have a pretty good website. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Andrew Davies, and I'd also like to say there are 4 empty seats in the front row if anyone would like to come up now and sit. There's 2 next to the projector, so please make your move.
Thank you, Megan. I want to thank Toronto Parks and Trees Foundation and Han for having us here at this lovely new space. It's really important to have these kinds of places where we can all gather. I see a lot of very familiar faces, people that we've done work with over the many years. My name is Andrew Davies. I'm the director of Number 9, Contemporary Art and the Environment. We're a non-profit charitable organization that uses the power of art and design to bring awareness to environmental issues. We started in 2006, and it's surprising how many projects we've chosen to do in the ravine system, and specifically the Dawn Ravine. I won't be able to talk to all the various ravine systems as Stephen has, but I think in some ways maybe you can look at some of these projects and think about how they might apply across the other areas. As you know, our ravine systems are what make Toronto so unique. We're really fortunate. I think we're just starting to sort of grasp how fortunate we are and what great opportunities they are for these open green spaces that work their way all the way through the city. Dawn Ravine, a short history, is a recreational natural history. At one point there was fishing in the Dawn River. These are some of the archival photos that we pulled out of the Toronto Archives when we were thinking about doing our project on the Lower Dawn. There used to be skating on the Dawn River. Apparently, because of the amount of salt that runs off the DVP now, the ice doesn't quite form anymore. There used to be swimming in the Dawn River. I'm not sure how many people would dare to do that these days, but maybe we'll get there again. So, it used to be a major recreational resource, and I think now you see people walking in the ravine system, you see them biking, but are there possibly more things that can be done? Of course, we have an industrialization history of the Dawn, and particularly fond of, everybody knows about Keating Channel, where the mouth of the Dawn does a complete 90 degrees turn. It's the opposite of natural, and actually Han was commenting that a lot of this sort of oil development in here is with the purpose of that was so that they could get the ships right in close and unload the oil. So obviously that's not there anymore, and there are some very exciting new plans for renaturalizing the Dawn and bringing back maybe some of the wetlands that the Humber has that Steve alluded to, that kind of magical, these kind of natural filtering systems. Let nature do its thing. Transportation is obviously a big part of a lot of our ravine systems. They're very handy for putting in railroads, and as we know about the Dawn and the DDP, for cars. So that obviously has an impact on your experience. And I think we need to find a balance now. So we've gone through this phase where it was a very recreational or natural space deficient. So, and then it was a space of transportation. And now we're kind of getting to the point where we have to understand that all these things can maybe happen at the same time, but through design and maybe organization, that we can actually have a very pleasant experience for pedestrians and for people to use these green spaces in our cities. So preservation has always played a major role, and increasingly. I'm here to talk to you about public art because that's what I know, and this is an amazing piece by Noel Harding called Elevated Wetlands that actually purifies the water by sucking it up, and then it runs through the actual elevated components. And it's all sucked up with solar power energy, and then it filters through these components and ends back into the dome. So, I mean, this is a kind of artwork, but it's also an environmental project at the same time. So, the photo on the right is one of our first major projects that we did with this group called BGL, these three hilarious, amazing guys from Quebec that are actually going to represent Canada at the Venice Biennial next year. So they've really come a long way, and this was back in 2008, and we basically installed a miniature replica of the Queen Mary 2 in the Don River for 3 months. So we had to deal with a lot of different people. The Toronto Regional Conservation Authority were great. We had to deal with the Port Authority and parks. And I can remember the idea of installing something on the old Eastern Avenue Bridge, which actually is an amazing old heritage bridge that goes nowhere. And this is actually, the boat's called Nowhere Too. And it's this idea of, like, you know, being a little bit lost, and you know, the boat, because it's black, alludes to a little bit of our sort of our consumption, our need to consume, and maybe our need to travel places but never get off the boat kind of thing. And how do we really engage with various places that we go? And you know, we've heard of the horror stories of, they don't do it anymore because I think they're much more regulated, but these cruise ships are just kind of, everybody's kind of eating and partying and they dump everything off the back, you know. And so this was this kind of more, I guess, ominous presence here in the Don. And you know, we have problems with storm runoff, and you know, it mixes with the sewage and ends up in the Don and then ends up in Lake Ontario. And we know we have problems with people dumping things off the side. And then this was much more of a hopeful kind of, you know, which I'm seeing is, as I meet people and we do these projects, people like Bring Back the Dawn people and a lot of the people that are here today, this kind of like, let's champion, let's bring this thing back, let's really pay attention. And so you have these two things that are staring to each other, and one of the things that we did do is we brought a lot of school children down there to look at this. So the artwork becomes a little bit like kind of urban acupuncture. So why would you go to the Don? Well, here's a reason to go to the Don. You can learn about art, but you can also learn what's going on. And we did these kind of little science experiments where kids would filter the mud and they'd find these crustaceans, and then depending on what they found, they could tell what the quality of the water was. And they made these little kind of stewards of the Don out of clay, where they were looking at, you know, these kind of half animal, half human figures that would overlook this piece. So they really engaged personally with the Don, and you know, we got these great comments back like, best field trip ever, stinkiest, but it was still the best. You know, it gets kind of high now. So this was a really interesting project for us, and what was interesting, because the water level changes so drastically, everybody knows about the flooding of the Don because they've basically forced this natural system into a channel. The boat kept drifting down the river, and we get these calls from the police, and they would be like, your boat's drift. People have been calling us about your boat drifting down the river. And I just thought it was interesting because, you know, millions of people were going by this thing. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is create this kind of impact on people's memories. And so those people that did see the project, I think, remember and refer back to it. we're very involved with Evergreen. Jeff is a good friend of mine. Actually, one of the reasons why my wife and I returned to Toronto was to get involved with this project, which I think is a fantastic project for Toronto. You know, Canada's largest environmental community center. And where are we going as far as sustainability? And this project was by Nathan Coley, who's a Scottish artist, and it's actually quite a famous work that was traveling around various places like Paris and Cologne and so forth. And we wanted to bring it here and just put that on top of the brickworks for a little while, and you know, you could see it from the bay view and so forth. And you know, it's just a bit of about like realizing that, you know, we have this kind of responsibility to cultivate, and we all have a role to play. And when I talk about the issue of moving to more a sustainable lifestyle, no matter what profession you're in, you can always make that small step. Like, everybody needs to make their own little step, and then we'll get there. So this is actually an example from the Humber River, where this guy, Peter Riddell, has been doing these balancing pieces. And this is sort of more like a kind of grassroots. We weren't involved with this project at all, but you know, it's just fascinating for people to see, and it's just a way of, you know, as you're walking along, or maybe it does draw some people down there to then they realize what a great, amazing asset it is to be able to walk along this river. So we have this amazing program called Imagine My Sustainable City, and what we realized kind of quickly is that if we really want change to happen, how about getting involved with some education? And so this is a week-long sustainable architecture and urban planning course that we've delivered in one grade 7 class in each of Toronto's 44 wards. So it's actually over 50 classes that we've done a week-long program in. It took us 3 years, but it was extremely rewarding. And this is a project in the First Nations Public School where this young student is actually drawing a turtle, which is very, has a lot of meaning and symbolic connection to their particular culture. And you can see it here. And he's actually created this kind of wetland habitat turtle at the mouth of the Don. And if you look at that in comparison to that kind of 90-degree Keating Channel, you start to get really excited. And then there was some minor programming like kayaking, rental shop, and you know, there was additional recreation here. And the students go through this incredible arc of learning all about walking through their neighborhood, you know, learning from 2 architect educators, learning from urban planners, learning how to look at what is sustainable, what is not, and then they learn how to draw their idea, then they learn how to model their idea, and then they actually present their idea to the counselor. So we had 19 of the 44 counselors were able to come in at the end of the week. So there's a whole governance, and there's a kind of, it's not like we're trying to produce a whole bunch of, you know, it's not like we want everybody to be an architect or a planner in 10 years, but they're going to be informed, civic-minded citizens with a base to sort of understand who represents them and what their city can be. And so, you know, if you, obviously we did 44 schools. I'd love to see this program for every grade 7. I mean, that would be an amazing accomplishment, I think, and would really change the way that we design our cities. I mean, it's a very simple strategy, which is as more and more of our global population move into our cities, if we can reduce our carbon footprint, we can have a tremendous effect on things like climate change. And that's going to come from our choice in lifestyle, and so we really need to have that kind of education. And this is a school along the Humber River, and you can see that they're just starting to explore this idea, like Steve was talking about portals, or like, how do we get into these spaces? And then when we get into these spaces, how do we do light touches? How do we, like, you'll see some of these things are elevated as to let the nature move underneath them and so forth. This was Westwood Middle School, which is actually just above Todd Morton Mills. There's quite a steep slope, and so there was these kind of ideas of these interesting libraries or habitat information centers with these kind of planks that you could sort of again, be above the ground plane to allow for natural habitat to occur underneath. And then just some ideas of, how you celebrate getting into the ravine system. This was Valley Park Middle School. There's this incredible bridge that runs across, but there's no way to get into the ravine below. You can just sort of kind of look down. So a lot of the students were looking at various ways of getting down from the bridge into the ravine system. And then once you're in there, what are the kind of animals that live there, and how does maybe some minor architectural interventions talk to the species. So, we can do a lot of talking and we can, get all jazzed up with the kids, but if we can't put our money where our mouth is, then, what good is that? So we took on the challenge of working with the city and heritage and exploring this idea of an eco art fest at Todd Morton Mills. And so to sort of Stephen's point of why do you need to go to the cottage? We established a beer garden with these incredible clay mugs that Dean Baldwin designed, and we had 7 different other commissioned art projects throughout the space that was referring back to the heritage of the site, but also looking at things in a kind of contemporary nature. So we had, food and drinks and live music and playmaking and workshops and guided tours, all of these kind of added amenities to these green spaces that sometimes are quite recreation or a playground or kind of the standard. So how do we let people know that they can come into these spaces? How do we provide these kind of amenities? This is actually on the opposite side of the Dawn from the brickworks, and I think most people know about the Lower Dawn Trail, which is, I'm going to talk a little bit about. There's a lot of exciting things going on with that. So this just shows, some of the pottery that was made by the various people. We had this kind of mechanical spinning wheel where you could kick it with your foot and make it go, and just show some of the clay mug making. The artist Dean made all these amazing mugs so that we didn't have to have plastic or paper cups or anything. So for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday and Sunday, we're open to the public. We had a bake oven, and we invited our friend Claudia up. I'm not sure she knew what she was getting into, but she was the bake master for the entire summer. And she made this charcuterie board, and it's called the Oxbow platter because of the oxbow that was. She started. We did it. It was basically a very large experiment, and we were even experimenting with the different types of sweet bread that you might be able to make. So, and then we teamed up with the Bowery Project, and they were growing herbs on site. So we were, doing the urban agricultural thing and putting that into the flatbread. And we had music on Saturday nights, so that you could hang out underneath the lights and have a beer and listen to some music. And then during the day we had these, art making programs. This is called our Handscape program, which is an Ian Baxter concept where you put your hand in, you draw your hand, and you create a landscape around that. And they were given these World Wildlife Adoption kits, so they were learning about, the habitat of that particular animal and why it was endangered and what they could do in order to take stewardship. And we created this portion from our Imagine My Sustainable City, which is called the Poetics of Architecture, in which they do a quick model study of some architectural elements that are both pleasing but also have environmental, sustainable, educational components to them. So this is just some of the tours. So these are some of the artworks. Ferruccio Sardella's here, and this is his William Taylor piece. This is actually old clay that he found from the brickworks when we started way back when, doing some interpretation there. And I love talking to people about this piece because they realized the land that they're actually standing on is like this clay, and this is what made this brickworks over here. And and then they're working with the clay, making the mug, and then they're having their beer or their whatever. And so it's all, you know, of course, it's that old thing that everything's interconnected, and you can really feel it through that process. This is a large piece, 12-foot high bell jar, image of a bell jar called cloche, which is really about sort of flipping things back. Just like bell jars are about containing nature, and then she sort of took the bell jar and threw it back in nature and said, you know, oh, there you go. And Sean Martindale did this amazing piece in the landscape here called Histories. He wrote out Histories, just kind of questioning like what do we choose to save and what don't we choose to preserve. Then there was the Don was here, and actually the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority was really supportive of this project and helped us sponsor it. Again, fruit shows piece. Harking back to this, I don't know if everybody knows the story about William Teller, but apparently he was out with one of his workers. They were digging a fence post, and they found this clay, and he took it down to one of the smaller brickworks, said, is this good for bricks? And of course there'd been the big fire in Toronto, and the guy was, yeah, that's really great clay. And so of course then he decided to go right into the brick making, and that's where the brickworks came from. So this is sort of about walking around and looking at artwork in nature, and this is a piece is Dissolving Houses by John Dixon. It's these 7 different houses. Some are more opaque and some are very reflective, and it was one of the most immersive pieces, and I think one of the most appreciated of the exhibit. It does hark back to this kind of daunting idea of Hurricane Hazel, and you know why we have the ravines now, why they're protected is because of Hurricane Hazel. This, again, the Don Was Here project, to sort of Steve's point about the crossing, outlined all the way down the Lower Don Trail, where the old Don used to go, and it had actually a technical component where you could go onto your smartphone, and it would, through GPS, it would show you where you were and where the river used to go, and it would give you some of these old archived images, and you could actually upload your own images as well. So, you know, trying to get people to get engaged with their open spaces. And this is another Sean piece, like a bridge, which is just in some ways talking about how we get from here to there, and of course that old Simon and Garfunkel song. This is a piece called Madame Jardin. It was a actually completely sustainable dress, which you could grow your own herbs, and you could, you know, walk around with it, and then at night you could actually crawl in underneath it and have shelter, and then she had a salad bowl detached to that, and then we took it to the Taste of the Dawn, and people were just like, wow, what's going on? Like, is that stuff for sale? And like, no, it's art. And of course, this is my daughter actually, so that was kind of special. These kids came down, they went for the big walk, they went to see the glass houses, and then she put on the dress and she walked out, and they saw her from like a distance. They call it charging towards her, you know, like this horde, and they were like, all, and this one girl after she looked up at her and she said, "Are you real?" And I guess, you know, I mean, to that effect, maybe it's a little bit like Disneyland, but with this whole other, like, value system associated with it. And this is this kind of ticket booth that Dean designed, and he had all his mugs set up in there, and he had the stage. This is our bake oven. We did some advertising, and so now I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to this, the public art plan for the Lower Don Trail, which is I worked on a master plan with DTAH, and you know they were doing a whole accessibility, but also, so what role does art play? And Stephen talked a little bit about the Highline. It's actually a very huge success, right? So the Highline was this abandoned, you know, elevated rail line that was, you know, dilapidated and sat there for decades. And sort of, you know, under-recognized, underutilized. So are there some similarities there between that and, you know, how we see our ravines? You know, is there an opportunity for, you know, art in the ravines? And this actually is the Keating Lower Down here, the Keating Channel, and this is the new Corktown Commons. This is where all the Pan Am Village will be. So the projected 80,000 people moving into this space, right? So where are those people going to want to have their recreation? Well, there's a line that goes all the way up here, right? And then you have brickworks up here and Todd Morham over there. So there's this new, the Valley Underpass, and so is there an opportunity there to do some mosaics and some amazing mosaics in Chicago that I also took on my vacation. Seems to be research and development happens on vacation.
Drives our lives nuts.
Yeah. And so is there an opportunity? This was actually the point where we actually installed the cruise ship and the life ring, and there seems to be a space there that gets, this was during Earth Day, we set up this tent there, but it's a kind of highlighted space that a lot of people go by, both in cars but also probably walking, because that's where the Valley Underpass will come out. These are just, other examples of Central Park. Creative Time has this huge, temporary public art revolving installations that they put on. This is the Riverdale Park Bridge, which is just down here. These are these huge structures that, is there a way to maybe graphically enhance them, that make them a little bit more playful, a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more intriguing, a little bit more exciting. Different lighting techniques. There's spaces underneath the Bloor Viaduct that are, right now they're getting a lot of sort of tagging but as you know, there are a lot of great urban illustrator or street artists out there. Dan Bergeron is one of our local ones that doing some great work. Is there potential to create a structure that people could activate so that when you're walking along, you're moving from one of these sort of experiences to another. And obviously, when you're on the Bloor Viaduct, you have this great, amazing view of the path below. Is there ability there? I'm not sure how many of you know, but there is a major Pan Am Legacy public art project underway, which is the lighting of the Bloor Viaduct by Derek Rivington. He's a master artist. He's the one that actually did the luminous veil. It was always meant to be illuminated, and I think we might be able to pull it off. We are going to pull it off for Pan Am, and it requires a very sophisticated system of lights and illumination through computer software, where the veil and the actual arches will be illuminated. There'll be something that happens when the train goes through. This will change with weather patterns, where the wind is coming from, what the temperature is, and it's not like I want to really emphasize. This is not going to be a Christmas tree kind of thing. These are very subtle moves. This is so more like a symphony. Like when you talk to Derek, he talks about orchestrating light as if it were music, and so he has a very, and the organization that's helping him has already done some of this lighting. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks very much.
So what we wanted to do now is to open up the floor for questions for both Steve and Andrew, but also just comments and thoughts that you might have about what you've seen tonight, the potential of the ravines to be transformed in so many ways, and transformed not necessarily drastically, but subtly, so that they are more welcoming and more interesting and more available to all of us. So please raise your hand, and I'll repeat your question if it's not audible, and we'll go from there. So anyone have any questions or comments? Go ahead.
I just want to comment about the programming that gets put into making a park happen, in the sense of let's have art, let's have picnic tables, let's do stuff. And one of the things that I find so lovely about a park is that it's a place where you can go to do nothing. We might, in terms of increasing the usage of the park, when we say usage, that's almost misleading in the sense that it would be great to create a culture in the city where people know that you go to the park to stop doing things. That you don't need programming in a park.
Yeah. What's interesting about Toronto's ravines is that they're so varied in character. There's some that are very hidden and very quiet, and I think it's important, I would agree, that we maintain them in that way. And then there's other areas like the Lower Don where there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of noise, and those areas might be able to accommodate more active uses. And so I think that's part of the nuance that's required when we think about the ravines, is to try to maintain that breadth of use across the system. I don't know if Steve or Andrew have any other ideas or comments about that.
Well, I would suggest that you go to the newest park that is being built in an area that isn't occupied yet. So we can talk about Corktown Common right now, which is going to be packed with people once the West Donlands is all completed and the Pan Am Games are over and everyone's moved in. But right now you go up there in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon and you can sit there and look at the city and there's hardly anybody there. But that's only temporary. But the ravines, Sean, they're like that. I mean, just get on a bike and go through any of the ravines on a weekday afternoon and you'll find lots of spaces like that. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, literally.
Just in terms of building the urban culture where people know that the park is where you can go to do nothing. That's in terms of, and that would take years, decades.
Good marketing campaign.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Sanem is our marketing bureau. She's writing notes down.
Go ahead.
I walked to work. I live in Christine and St. Clair, and I walked to Mount Pleasant, Eglinton. It's about the exact same time as transit. But I no longer go to the Ravine Park between Spadina and Heath. It's a nice diagonal. It's just not safe. I mean, I've run into problems down there. So it's unfortunate because it's so beautiful, but there's a point where nobody can really see you. And that's where I ran into trouble one day. So I think that it's not just a perception of safety. There needs to be actual safety in areas. People don't use that, certainly. There's only a little tiny window time of day where I know I will see other people and be okay. So it's a bit of a shame because it's such a beautiful part. I can hook up on the Beltline. You always see people on the Beltlines, it's not a problem. So if we're going to have people doing a lot more active transportation and using these to get to and from work or to get to places, it needs to be a bit safer.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, there's this balance between having quiet, hidden away spaces and having enough people there to actually have the eyes on the park, and to have enough people there that you do feel safe. And I think because the ravines, again, don't quite have all of those portals yet, or those portals that go into the ravines are kind of dirty places with lots of garbage. People don't want to go in there, and those places do then become unsafe places because only perhaps the people who might be, wanting to cause a few problems would go in there.
There's an interesting parallel if you think about the way that Central Park in New York City was perceived 20 years ago and the way it's perceived now. And it would be, I think, a valuable kind of case study to understand what are the policy changes and the physical changes and also the information that was broadcast to the public over that transitional period to allow Central Park to essentially pull itself out of a very kind of unsavory public perception and reality into something that is much more widely available and used today. And I think, the ravines are not the 1980s Central Park, I don't think, but there are definitely issues both in terms of perception but also in the physical reality that we need to work on. Go ahead.
There seems to be an intuitive conflict between the desire to create what Steve called the high-quality natural spaces, the dark green areas, versus the desire to create portals to suck people and their activities into those spaces. And the question I have is, how do you balance that? How do you prioritize and control and lead things in the direction that we don't want. I presume there's as much naturalization as possible to create these quiet spaces.
Yeah, it is a real challenge. You know, as our city grows, these areas are going to become under a lot more stress, for sure. There are different ways of dealing with that. I mean, the Conservation Authority, we have a tremendous inventory program. So we have biologists and ecologists who go out and they inventory the different types of flora and fauna. And you see on the map, you know, where those large green areas are, you have a tremendous concentration of the more rare species and a much greater quantity of those species. And those are the areas that you absolutely have to ensure are well preserved. And typically, I'm not a landscape architect or ecologist, but my understanding is that the way you do that is by concentrating people to a linear path through those areas and designing it in such a way that people don't spread out, create their own spaces within those high quality habitats. And then, of course, you have the other side where you have the low quality habitats, don't have a whole lot of species that are already heavily degraded. And in those cases, again, I think the same theory applies. If you create the appropriate paths and place for people to go, and then you renaturalize and create these really robust habitat restoration areas within those spots, you can actually get a better balance between the natural heritage preservation and enhancement and the use by people. And I think there's some real design solutions to this, but it's not easy, absolutely. We struggle all the time with this in
Does
planning.
TRCA or the city have any data, kind of controlled experiments effectively to ask the question, is there, if we draw people in and show them how nice it is, does the city become more willing to spend the money necessary to naturalize?
But that's a good point too, because the more people who love those spaces, the more people are going to go to their local counselor and say, hey, you've got to do something to protect them. That's the whole activism side that I was talking about. So again, yes, that's the other balance between getting everyone in and loving it and, you know, working together to create the better spaces and better habitat, or keeping everybody out and just letting it do its thing. It's a tough call sometimes. I don't think we have any studies to that effect, but I will keep that in mind.
Maybe a follow-up on that in terms of communicating the value of green spaces. Are you working with the value of natural capital or nature deficit or nature well-being, but putting a dollar value on that to actually show that it's an investment for the larger health of the city? And maybe as a footnote, that developer on the Heuchert East or
Heuchert East.
What was in for them to give up that land? I mean, you know, the developer giving up land, they will probably got something out of it. So what was the trade-off?
To your first question about research and natural capital in human health, it's not something that I do in my work, although I know that there are a number of studies out there that look at sort of nature deficit disorder, for example, when people aren't exposed to green at all and how that affects their health. And, you know, the ability to have parks and recreation obviously will help a lot of health. But in terms of studies, I can't really speak to that. In terms of your other question on the Heuchert East site, what was in it for the developer, there's a couple of things. One is that we have a very strong policy at the Conservation Authority and the city's official plan that new development has to be out of those ravines and they have to be appropriately buffered. And then that's the sort of base policy which all developers have to follow. And sometimes they fight us on it, and sometimes they decide not to. In this case, the developer was more than willing to rehabilitate that space as well, put in the appropriate trail systems, because they recognized that they were creating a community of new people where there was nobody there before. And I think the developers often will use that as a marketing tool for their development. And also, the whole project was at the Ontario Municipal Board. And in those types of situations, the parties try to get rid of the other parties. And so we entered into a negotiated settlement with them to ensure that all of this happened if and when the development was approved at the Ontario Municipal Board. So there's a lot of push and pull, but I have to give the developer a lot of credit here. The company was called Nexon Developments. They're the same ones who did the Menico project I showed, and they've always been great to deal with. And a lot of developers really are. They actually really care about what they're building. And they want to do a high quality product and they want to win awards in the end. They're not all like that, but
It probably adds value to their property.
and it adds value to their property and their sales, I'm sure.
Would you like to go and then I'll take you?
The buried rivers and waterways, how much is buried in Toronto versus the Ravine open water? And what are the benefits or disadvantages of opening now?
Okay.
So you're referring to channelized watercourses or the ones that have been essentially lost,
Lost.
redirected? And
Lost. They're just in tunnels now.
Yeah, there's certainly a great deal of that in Toronto. I mean, there are a number of projects. I don't know the authors of the Lost Rivers project. Andrew, I don't know if you could chime in there, but the Garrison Creek, all the creeks that are in the downtown core that have been either buried or redirected, and there have been over the course of the last number of decades the kind of interest in retracing those paths. Whether or not they can actually be reinstated as open watercourses, I'm not sure at this point, but certainly their memory is alive and well, I would argue, in the downtown.
My understanding of a lot of the buried watercourses is that they are often combined sewers. So you have not only sanitary, but you also have stormwater. And if you think about it as two inverted U's next to each other, and they have a limited capacity. So when you have a very high storm events, those two, the sewage and the stormwater combine, and of course it all ends up in the lake. And the city of Toronto right now is working on an environmental assessment to deal with this in the Don watershed. So what they are planning to do is to take all of the combined sewage that happens in these high storm events and put them into these massive chambers that will be built along the Don River, underground, and then those chambers will allow the stuff that you don't want in there to settle out and then be sent to the water treatment plant at a later date. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar project, and it will probably take 25 years to build. But the difficulty with opening up a lot of these buried watercourses is that there's so much development around it that it becomes problematic, especially when you're dealing with major sewer systems, and very, very expensive. And unless you can do the whole reach and reconnect it to the lake, you're not really going to be able to bring back the fisheries, because the fisheries will not be directly connected to that, maybe a short piece that is opened up. So it's difficult. It's difficult. We're asked this question sometimes by community groups, and when a development happens and it's a small stretch of a buried creek, and it's very, very hard to do.
There's one precedent not too far away, actually, Mud Creek, that runs through the Evergreen Brickworks, was at one point in the Brickworks history buried under a number of buildings that were used for the brickmaking process, and in the early 90s that creek was actually renaturalized, and it formed the first official greenway in the brickworks, which inspired us as architects to develop further greenways cutting through that site. So that's one local example of where we have been able to reclaim a creek. Fellow Burgundy?
Yeah, sort of getting out of the ravines a little bit, going the opposite direction. You mentioned the New York High Line. You can't really do any research online about like urban agriculture or urban landscaping without running into something about praise for the High Line. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts might be on any ideas or proposals for Toronto-based High Lines. I could think of two. There's one group that wants to build one on top of the Gardiner. There's another group that wants to build one King West, like going the King High Line, I think it's called, going through Liberty Village. Do you think there's any legitimate opportunities there, or should we be looking at other areas and possibly connecting them with other ravines?
I'm going to let the architect answer that one.
Well, I mean, the gardener has been a topic of great debate for a long time, and a number of proposals have been brought forward. We were involved in the gardener competition for the east end of the gardener to investigate different strategies of whether, if it were to be taken down, how would it be done and what would it look like? If it were to be maintained, you know, what kind of development are we permitted to imagine on either side? And that's still in the city's coffers and in their minds, sort of wrestling with what the future of at least that portion of the gardener is long term. I mean, the High Line, speaking of capital and kind of catalyzing effects of open space, the High Line has done an absolutely tremendous job in completely revitalizing the entire west side of Lower Manhattan. The amount of capital that is coming into that neighborhood, the amount of investment that is now flooding its way into an area that was otherwise pretty derelict a number of decades ago, I think is a good demonstration to the municipalities across the world of what a good payback good public open space is in the long term. And I think, you know, can be argued that the waterfront Toronto's work on Queen's Quay, which our office is also heavily involved in, is a demonstration of that. That, you know, you may argue that the umbrellas are too expensive, but people come to Toronto and spend tourist dollars and invest in Toronto because there are unique places to visit. And I think the Ravines are another place that we have that other cities don't have. But right now the Ravines are hidden, and they're not in the face of the tourists who come here. They're not available or in the kind of imagination of the folks that visit here every day. And part of our kind of interest, I think, as part of this exhibition is to figure out how to get the Ravines kind of front and center so that they might have that same kind of draw as the High Line does in Lower Manhattan. But it's a really great tool for developers, for municipalities, you know, build the street, build the park, and the people will come. Corktown Common's another great example of that. I live not too far away, but there's people from all over the city going to Corktown Common because it's got an amazing children's play space. It's got an amazing area where you can sit and read and listen to crickets in the downtown. And I think that kind of investment is truly remarkable in its catalytic potential.
And it has the best public washrooms in the city.
I'll take maybe a few more. I know we're running a bit over time, but first you, then you.
Well, the ravines are sensitive areas ecologically, and my worry is how much is too much of increasing the number of people there, and can design address the issues of sort of teaching people what to do and what not to do, where to go and what to leave. Christine.
You know, you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things we often miss when we do development planning, master planning, precinct planning, whatever you want to call it, is that natural heritage component. So we're so busy looking at the streetscape and where the buildings are going to go and how high they're going to be and the setbacks and the type of paving materials, that we often forget that there's a design component to the natural systems as well. It's not about just leaving them there. It's about putting in robust renaturalizations. You know, and these things are all designed. I mean, we have a whole crew of people who do nothing but the flood studies and the water flow studies and the soil testing to actually build these amazing restoration projects. So I think when we do our urban planning and our precinct planning, we need to include that component and bring in the right experts for that too. They're not always at the table.
I think the Toronto's parks and trails wayfinding strategy is also going to do a great deal to improve the situation as far as keeping people on the designated trails and dissuading people from using the kind of makeshift trails that have been established over the years. In part, maybe by, you know, kind of crazy mountain bikers who just rip through the ravine, but oftentimes by people who just don't know that the trail to the left is not the way that they should go. And so, you know, just the addition of a layer of signage and mapping, which it's remarkable how little exists now. Even at the best entry points to the ravine, like Milkman's Lane, there's not a sign there. And so to have people, you know, come to the portal of the ravine or an entrance point or a gateway and say, okay, I'm gonna go this way, and then I'm gonna take a left, and then I'm gonna go over there, and I'm gonna use that washroom, and I'm gonna sit in that park, and I'm gonna come home, will do a great deal to kind of control, I think, and prevent that kind of misuse that oftentimes is accidental.
And I think we need specialized applications on our phones as well. I mean, I don't know if you ever tried cycling around Toronto using Google, but it takes you to some pretty weird places. So anything that is much more well designed on your screen that shows you exactly where to go and is really user friendly, I think is a huge demand for that. So any app developers out there, go to work.
Would you like to go next?
Well, I take the word of the night is portal. And I agree, there's nice ways to get into places to invite you in. I'm actually live in the Rosedale Moore Park area and walk that ravine all the time, and I don't know if you're aware of this issue with the Trolley Park switchback. That was not going to be a nice inviting portal. That was going to be an asphalt armor stone, which seems to be the city of Toronto's kind of material of choice. I think here they hire architectural firms to do this wonderful design, and that was going to be their idea of a portal into the ravine. I think it will be sorted out, some kind of compromise will come, that the whole thing is trying to keep something natural and not put something so invasive. And under the demise of accessibility, it's a steep hill. It wouldn't be safe to be an accessibility spot to the brickworks anyway, when there's multiple other spots that are flat. So I was just wondering if you're aware of what your thoughts were, because that to me would not be an inviting architectural portal into a park. That was going to be an invasive structure.
I haven't actually seen the designs myself, but what I can say is that oftentimes, like the one I showed you at Park Lawn, when the construction is happening, it looks awful. You know, the trees get ripped out and the soil's everywhere and all this stone and hard material is coming in, and it can look quite bad. But once the plants, the native plants and everything grow back up, you may be surprised at how nice it could be. But in terms of the types of materials that are used, I can't really speak too much to that particular project, I'm afraid.
Did you look at the materials used at the High Line? Are the best of the best. I mean, it's high design, it's refined.
Right.
Armor stone is not high design, refined. It's a cheap material that, you know, people build roads with. It's not meant to be in a ravine system. And they're actually using that at Mud Creek too, to get the full water, which isn't actually the correct way. You want to absorb the water into the soil, not keep funneling it down to create more flooding. So
the armor stone is used often because of the fact that when you do have the flash floods, it really is the only material that they know of is heavy and hard enough to actually keep the riverbanks in place. It's a real compromised situation out there because Mud Creek was obviously buried in the past and channelized, whereas before it used to have a really wide floodplain and the river can do its thing. Now you're trying to shove it into a small area because you've got development all around it, and there's this balance that has to be made between the hardening and the renaturalization component. But I would just encourage you to keep the design discussion going. You know, push the public officials to use the best quality products available out there to improve the aesthetics of these things, because it's important.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the Highland. We keep referring to the Highland because it's kind of the go-to example. But one of the things I find really interesting about that project is it's very much driven by a public-private collaboration. So people got involved, they got involved with the design, they got involved with actually having to pay for it. They have an ongoing foundation, not so dissimilar from Trees and Parks Foundation, that was established to help fund the curation of the artwork. They have revolving shows. So it's one of those amazing projects because so many people are investing. And I think there's the opportunity for that in our ravine systems. And I always want to refer back to Stephen's first slide, where you see how massive, in comparison to Central Park, our ravine systems are. And I think, you know, I'm getting the sense there's a concern about, oh, we're going to lose those spaces where you can just go and be quiet and look at nature. And I think if you look at that image, you'll see that, you know, if it's properly orchestrated and organized and with good leadership, there can be those components where it's really quiet and there isn't a lot of, you know, massive pressure from population. But there are going to be, like I showed you, the Corktown Commons. Those 80,000 people are coming there, you know, whether we like it or not, and they have direct access to that trail. So it's either going to be mayhem or it's going to be really well designed and an amazing experience. So I think, you know, I think we can set aside those areas that we know of that we are for those, you know, the hikers that want to go out and immerse themselves in quiet nature. And then I think there are other areas where we can really play on the fact that this is one of our jewels, and this is a place like the High Line where you can come and you can learn about the city and its history and some of its contemporary artists.
I agree. They're two separate spaces. And that's one thing the City of Toronto is trying to do, a blanket ravine plan. But every ravine is special and unique with a different dynamic. And you can't put the same kind of formula in every spot in Toronto. And that's where I've been a bit disappointed with the City of Toronto, because they had their formula, this is what it's going to be. They want the Beltline to be like the Rosedale Moore Park, to be like, so no, I like your philosophy. You need to mix and you have to read who is going to be using it, what are the users, and you know, there are people, I have given people directions down in our ravine multiple times, it is not signed correctly, but there are people that do come from out of town that just have heard about it and they're trying to figure out the way to get it where it works, and I always direct them. But there are different, you have to read what is the usage of one particular ravine and not say, okay, it's going to be for cyclists, it's going to be for walkers, it's going to be for, they're all unique and different. And then the art space is not going to work on a hiking trail per se. You have to keep that in another section. So.
And even the Brickworks Park, since Evergreen has moved in, it's experiencing some changes, and it was not designed to handle that many people. So just there, which is an environmental community center, there are tensions. So it's a constant in the city, especially as our population grows.
Yeah, and we're building denser and denser, and more people are moving into the city, so we've got to start designing. But I mean, we're so fortunate. Imagine if we didn't have any of this green space. You know, where would people go? You know, I think we have this amazing asset, and I think if we think about it and start planning now and start imagining and start engaging community and talking to our kids and taking our students down there, I think, you know, it's an amazing time in Toronto right now. I really think we're at a very, very exciting period.
So I think with that note, I know that there's a few more questions, and I would encourage the folks with questions to come talk to us at the end of this, but we've I think run out of time. So I'd like to thank Andrew and Steve very much for participating in this lecture, and everybody here for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. The RavinePortal exhibition, which is hosted at 50 Park Road by DTAH, is on until November 21st. It's part of a larger initiative called the Worldwide Storefront. The idea there being that there's 10 storefronts or exhibitions that are hosted by individuals and groups all around the world that are each speaking to very specific local issues that pertain to the art and the design community. So I'm the curator of the Toronto exhibition on ravines, believing that the ravines are really, that their time has come to really, for us to be really serious about their future. And I would encourage you to go onto the website for the Worldwide Storefront, www.storefront.org. You can see each of the 10 storefronts and their content and read about a little bit more about what each participant is trying to do. And there's also ways for you to feedback on that website. So with that, thank you very much and have a good evening. There's some water and snacks here.